Is there no one else? Hey guys, Jared here with the Shooting Institute, bringing you one of our educational videos. Today we're going to be going over mounting a rail for your optic, your scope rings, your scope, balancing that, and bore sight, then out to the range so we can go ahead and get shots on paper. So we're going to get into it. As you see laid out here on the table, I have everything that I need. Right here, this is just the case for the Fat Max torque wrench. Again, I'm not pushing any brands here. This is an actual customer's gun that we're working on, and so we're just going to go through it with their gun. However, a Fat Max torque wrench is very useful. We have an arc and scope and rings. That's what they ordered. This little tool, this little wrench comes with the arc and rings, and that fits those rings so you can go ahead and get them on there finger tight before you use the torque wrench. I have a regular level right here, a weighted level. You can use any types of levels that you want. It doesn't necessarily have to be perfectly bubble level for a lot of what we do, whitetail deer hunting at close range, but at the same time, if I'm shooting a little bit further, I want to make sure that this is as level as it possibly can be. I've got my scope rail. This is an EGW 20 MOA rail. Got a little bit of Loctite right here for the screws that hold the scope rail. So you can see the little screws right here. They come in the package. I make sure I have all this out, and I've got a T-bit that fits those screws that came with them. So I've got everything I need. Now I know the action's facing away from y'all, but you can see we've already removed the bolt from the rifle. We know it's clear and safe. You check the chamber. We obviously have the magazine out sitting down here for the rifle, so I know everything's clear and safe, and I can go through the process of mounting the rail, the rings, and then the scope. You can use little alcohol wipes or alcohol pads. I just have this paper towel right here that I put a little rubbing alcohol on, and I just want to go ahead and wipe off the top where these holes are that are where my base is going to sit before I put it in there. Just make sure any debris and stuff's out. This is a brand new gun, just pulled it out of the box, so there shouldn't be anything too bad on it. All right, so once you get that wiped off with your alcohol pad, you're going to get your rail, okay? Now my rail right here, you can see sits perfectly in place. If this is an improper rail, or if it's not the right rail for the gun, the holes on the top will not line up. Okay, so this is a Remington 700 action on this Bagara. So you would order a Remington 700, in this case short action 20 MOA rail. Now, these screws right here, some of these screws come pre-coated with Loctite, either blue Loctite or like a white sort of Loctite. I don't know if that's the actual brand. These, however, did not. So I always have a little bit of Loctite with me. I'll put some right here on my, just on the edge of my gun stand. You can do it however you like, doesn't really matter. And then I'll just roll that screw. I'm gonna put the rail in place. I'm gonna take my T-bit. I'll make sure that it's lined up. A lot of the times on these, not a lot of times, all the time on these 20 MOA rails, because it's 20 MOA, 20 minutes of angle, the back is going to be higher than the front, so the screws are going to sit deeper in the rail on the back end than they will on the front end. Now, I've got my torque wrench. I don't necessarily have to use a torque wrench. A lot of guys use different specs. I've seen it up to 65 inch-pounds on these. I always start out with 30. And that's generally about where I'll sit, but I'll do it like a car tire or a wheel on a car, go back and forth in a pattern. You don't have to do that here, but it helps seat this thing evenly across the board so you're not over torquing one and not the other. All right, so I get it about as tight as this thing's gonna pop at 30, and I get it there. So 30 feels pretty tight. I'm gonna back it down to about 25 so I don't strip this or shear anything off. There you go, that's 25. That's 25. 25, 25. All right, so it's all set at 25. I'll bump it up to 30. Let's see if we can get 30. So I feel like the T-bit is gonna start stripping when I go to 30, so I'm not gonna keep going past that, and that's the best way to see. Like I said, I've seen guys set these at 20 or 65 inch-pounds. I don't generally do that. I put them finger tight. This right here is 28, and it holds really well at 28, so that's where we're gonna leave it at. So we've got the rail on the gun. It's Loctited. We put it in at 28 inch-pounds based off our torque wrench, and it should be good to go. I will, after I put the rail on, just to make sure I don't have something going on right here. And again, I know the action is facing away from y'all. I'll put the bolt in, make sure that I can cycle the bolt, and I don't have something hanging down from these action screws in the chamber. So perfect, that works. Go back, remove your bolt, put it back out of the way. Next thing, we're gonna mount our scope rings. When I mount my scope rings, I want the side with the screws to be away from the action. So like on a Nightforce set of rings, they have that nut. So that nut, I want to be away from the action. This one, it doesn't matter as much because these sit flush like they do right here. But just out of habit, I always turn them away from the action. The reason for that is because some of the heavier scope rings or scope rings with a nut, if it's on the side that the brass throws out of, the brass will fly up oftentimes and it will pop one of those nuts sticking out on your scope ring. So in order to mitigate that or keep it from happening, I want to put those away from the actual chamber of the action. All right, so we're going to go ahead and put on our scope rings. Another thing when putting these scope rings on, this is a short action rifle, but on a long action, they're going to be spaced out a little bit more. I like to put these scope rings at the front and the back of the action. If I have to move them on the scope later, I will. But at least starting out, I like to put them at the front and the back of the action because that means my scope ring is out of the way of the where my brass is going to fly when I throw my bolt. Now on these rings at the front right here, it says I need to set them at 30 inch-pounds. All right, so I've already got my torque wrench set to 30 inch-pounds or almost 30 inch-pounds. It's at 28 right now. So I'll go ahead and just dial it up 2 more. And I'll do the same thing and lock these in place because when we make this thing even, or try to make it even, or not even, level, when we make this thing level, I want these things to be locked down as tight as they're supposed to be, so I'm not tightening them after, because sometimes this will change things. Now, another thing, and I don't know if you noticed it, but when I put these rings on, I made sure that I had pulled them all the way forward. I pushed them forward against the forward Picatinny rail. The reason for that is because as the rifle recoils, it recoils back into the ring right here as opposed to recoiling away from the ring. So it helps keep these in place. I have had scope rings shake loose on me, just like I talked about the base shaking loose earlier. So one thing that I do pretty much every time I shoot any of my long range guns like this is I'll put my torque wrench on the rings, and I also put it on the top rings that actually hold the scope. After every time that I shoot, I put the gun away, and every time I pull it out of the box, I'll just go ahead and I'll check everything to see if it's tight to make sure nothing's backing out, and that will mitigate issues with your rifle losing zero or grouping. Oftentimes it's not the scope, it's the rings or the rail that hold the scope in place. Now, we can do this a couple different ways. We'll talk about the flat spot on the scope surface in a little bit. But what I want to do, I take my level, I put it in place on a flat spot on my rifles. Some rifles with chassis, you can do it on the chassis itself. But all I'm wanting to do is make sure that this rifle's even, or it's the rifle's level, okay? So I make sure the rifle's level, I'm level right there, and now I'm gonna put my scope in place. Take the bikini cover off so it doesn't continue to get in your way. Set my scope in place right here. Now if you look, I have a little bit of forward play and a little bit of back play, and my scope rings are sitting perfectly in front of and behind my action. Now sometimes I'll run lows, and this rifle could run a low, but these are medium rings. Medium's about the best height that you can pretty much run on any bolt gun, even if you have a larger objective lens, okay? It gives me enough space, or the space I need. These are probably a little bit too high for this rifle, but that's gonna be okay because I know I've got the clearance that I need right here to go ahead and mount this scope up. All right, so once I get my rings in there and get my scope in there, I'm gonna go ahead and put top part of my rings back on. On these rings, these arcing rings, they say 18 inch-pounds on the rings, and that's pretty common for these ring screws, these ring set screws. It's gonna clamp down. You don't wanna go too tight. A lot of guys go too tight, and on these aluminum body scopes, especially with aluminum rings, you will warp the tube of the scope. So a lot of guys just crunch these things down as tight as they can, but it can warp the tube of the scope. So a lot of guys lap the inside of the rings. Sometimes I will. These rings from Arkin come precision, or they come milled pretty precisely. Night Force rings do. Guys will still lap them to take out the little burrs and all that stuff, but either way, I want to get these rings on there tight enough to hold the scope in place, but not so tight that I can't turn it, right? So that's gonna be pretty good right there. And I'll go back to making sure that I set it so the scope is clamped down even on either side right there. Now you see how I still have play in the scope, so I'm not gonna be able to level it perfectly while there's still play in the scope. The first thing I wanna do is check the area for my eye box. And on short action rifles like this 6.5 Creedmoor, that's gonna be about perfect. I might scoot it back a little bit, but it's basically gonna be about where that bolt throw is. An average, everybody runs about the same average eye box. You're looking at about 1 to 3 inches even, right? But if I look at this right here, the length of the bolt, that's where I'll generally set it. Now we can make those adjustments when I get down behind the gun, and it's gonna be different per shooter. I'm mounting this up for a customer, and we're gonna get data for him and all that, so he's got a gun that's set up, we ship it to him, he's ready to go hunting with it, and can shoot it out to 800 meters. So we're gonna set it up for him. However, if you're setting up your own gun at home, I would take time to get behind the gun and make sure that my eye relief is set appropriately. Again, that eye box is pretty common for most people. It's gonna be about 1 to 3 inches. So if I look through this gun right here, that feels pretty comfortable. I might bounce it back just a hair, but as I get down behind the gun, yeah, it's pretty comfortable. Seems even. Now, I've got to level the scope out, right? So I level my gun out. Make sure when you get down behind it, you don't bump it. If you want to put it back on a flat surface of the gun, you most certainly can. And now, once I know that, I'm gonna make sure that my scope is sitting level. So it's just off-candid just a little bit. And after I check my scope to make sure it's level there, I'll look back through my crosshairs and make sure that it looks relatively even as well. Level there. And I can do that by lining it up on a straight edge. I got a flag across the wall on me, and I'm doing it like that right there. So the gun is level, the scope is level. I feel pretty happy about it. I can put this down, and then I can take my torque wrench, turn it down to 18 inch-pounds. Got that here. And I'm gonna go through just like I did earlier, going back and forth between the screws, making sure that this thing is tight, but we're maintaining level. All right, it's tight. I'm gonna look at my rings, make sure that they're relatively even across the board here. There we go. There we go. All right. So once I look at my rings, it looks like they're relatively even across the board. I'm gonna go ahead and go in here and start working my rings down with my torque wrench. I'm still going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. All right, so they're all in there at 18 inch-pounds. I can look at my rings to make sure that they were pressed evenly across either side. I'll know if I look through my scope and it's not level. I'll put this bubble level back on the flush spot on top of the gun. At this point in time, I should need to move the gun to level it out because the scope is already tight and it is perfect. So now my scope is level according to the bubble level, according to the line on the wall, or the straight edge on the wall, according to the rifle, how the rifle's sitting. So we're level, or we're at least as level as we can get it with utilizing a straight edge on the wall with a crosshair and a bubble level. So our scope is mounted, or our base is mounted, our scope is mounted, and our scope is level. Now we have to go ahead and bore sight the weapon system. Okay, so when doing a bore sight, you want to line up your bore on a target down range. Now my bore is the end of the muzzle where the bullet comes out of, and then I'm going to take my bolt out and make sure that I can look through the muzzle, and I'm going to get this rifle as stable as possible. We have it in a vise right here. You can put it on sandbags in a bipod. We do that at the range all the time. But I want to get the rifle as stable as possible, and I'm wanting to line up the target down range, center of this bore, by looking through the bore and seeing it. You can also do this with a laser. You can put a laser, they make laser bullets that you put in your gun. You can put it in there and move your crosshairs to that. However you do it, a bore sight is basically looking down the bore and then making my crosshairs match what that bore is looking at. In this case at 10 yards, we're gonna be doing that where the bore is lined up, but the bore is lined up 2 1/4 inches lower than where our crosshairs are looking at because we're at 10 yards and we want to make it match for a 100-yard zero. Okay, so you see the target, you see the B that we're talking about that we just lined the muzzle up on, okay? So the muzzle's lined up on the B, it's at 10 yards, and you see there's a blue piece of tape over the B. What we want to do is we want to dial our reticle, which we're going to turn on in a second, and you'll see it looks like a red dot. We want to dial our reticle up to the blue piece of tape. As we start turning it, we see, oh no, it's moving down away, so we're going to turn it the opposite direction. One thing to note is when you're bore sighting your weapon system, moving it the opposite direction of bullet impact is what's going to get you there. So if the turret says up, that's talking about bullet impact, I want to move it down in order to move my reticle. All right, so focus back on the B. We see that B nice and clear. We see the blue tape up there. And then focus back on our reticle. We still see that we're a little bit left. So again, we're going to dial till we're a little bit left. Okay, so now at 10 yards across the office, we got a good bore sight. We're 2 1/4 inches low, so that means our muzzle is lined up 2 1/4 inches lower than our crosshairs based on this bore height of 2.75. We've dialed it in on the elevation. We've dialed it in on left to right. We're about 7/10 of a mil down on the elevation, and we're about 2/10 of a mil to the left, which means we had to move our reticle to the right on our windage. So we're set with a good bore sight. Now when we get out to the range, we could line up, we could shoot, and we're gonna hit the paper somewhere, but when we get out there, we'll look through the bore, we'll make sure that it's lined up on a target at 100 meters or 100 yards, whatever you're zeroing it at, and we'll make sure we add any fine adjustments that we need to right here, and we'll fire those first shots down range when we get outside. That's the scope mount and level portion of how to set up our rifle. We've got everything dialed in. We've got our scope base on properly. We've got our rings on properly. Everything's tightened down. The scope is leveled. We've gotten a quick bore sight. We're ready to get out to the range and fire our first shots to go ahead and gather some data. Once we gather an appropriate zero, gather some data on this rifle so we can take it hunting or take it to the range. So we're gonna head out to the range next. You can check out our range video with how we gather data on this, but that's the end of this video, how to set up a scope, level it, balance it, make sure everything's good to go so we can get out to the range and get real work done. Is there no one else?